Cities became prominent. The cities began to get bigger and bigger as time went on. And eventually, these cities were to lead to the growth of kingdoms. Now, the kings were able to develop their power partly as a result of the Crusades. When the nobility went off to fight, kings were left oftentimes, kings oftentimes went along, but sometimes they stayed behind. And they were able to build up their power while the nobility was out fighting the Saracens or the Muslims over here. Now, I want to elaborate on the Norman conquest of England. Again, the word Norman means Northman. The man who did it was William the Conqueror. What had happened, William the Conqueror was a playmate to one of the kings of England when he was growing up. And as this playmate promised, yeah, when I'm gone, you'll be king. This playmate grew up and never married. He was very much like a monk, and he actually did marry, but he never consummated his marriage, so he had no children. So he died without heir. And instead of the throne being given to William, the throne was given to somebody else who did not have what you call blue blood in his veins. He had no right to the throne because his ancestors had not been king. So William the Conqueror, who was Duke of Normandy at the time, but who was related to the royal line, he got together an army. His army consists of men from this part of northern France and what's today Holland and Belgium. And he went in and he defeated the usurper king of England, and he took over the throne himself. And every king of England from that day till this has traced his ancestry to William the Conqueror, including our present Queen Elizabeth II, traces hers to William the Conqueror. Now, this will not be on the test, but I'm going to give a very personal note about William the Conqueror. One of the men from the land of Flanders, which is today Belgium, one of the men who followed was a man named Warnebald. As a result of his services, Warnebald was given land up here in Scotland. The land was called the County of Cunningham. Warnebald then took the surname of Cunningham. He married a Cunningham girl, and eventually his descendants became earls of the Cunningham County. They remained earls until 1801 when the last male heir died out and they didn't have any provision for a woman to take over. But they became the earls of Cunningham family. And if you visit Scotland, you'll find the Cunningham name really prominent around the city of Paisley, Scotland. And my great-great-grandfather came from Paisley in about 1845. Was he related to the nobility? The odds are, if you go back far enough, he was, because let's face it, folk, you have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 grandparents, 16 great-grandparents, no, 8 great-grandparents, 16 great, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 428, 256, 512. The odds are that we are related to nearly everybody who was alive 1,000 years ago, whether you're white or black. How's that? I mean, most of you probably know the answer to that. If somebody offered you a penny today and double that every day for 30 days, 1 cent, 2 cents, 4 cents, 8 cents, for 30 days, or $1 million outright, would you take the penny double or the $1 million outright?
$1 million.
No, you wouldn't. Not if you do. How many of you know better? You would take the penny double, because at the end of 30 days you'd have $2 million. If you don't believe it, and I don't believe you don't, do the math.
No, I wouldn't say.
In just 30 generations, folk, you have 2 million ancestors. I mean, have you ever seen this done?
Yeah.
You have. I've done it myself. You've seen it done. You take the penny doubling, which means that, being European, I'm probably related to everybody who lived in Scotland around the year, or Great Britain around the year 1000, including royalty. But I've not been able to trace it back that far. Again, this is just some personal note. I always throw in about this time. But William the Conqueror conquered England. and took over and set up a new dynasty that was to last. Now, your book was going to take it from here, from one nation at a time, starting with England and going from England to France. Essentially, you have with William, after William, there were a few kings, then came King Henry. King Henry II was the one who married Eleanor of Aquitaine and whose sons rebelled against him. King Henry set up a lot of the law that England still goes by. King Henry at first told his judges they could use the laws of Justinian, and if they couldn't find a law that covered a case under Justinian, they could make up a law. The nobles said, no, this gives the judges too much power. So then the king limited the power of the judges. And folk, I'll tell you the truth, I wish today somebody would limit the power of our judges. As long as our judges make all of our moral decisions for us, we don't have democracy. But our judges actually make law and overturn laws that are passed by elected officials and even overturn the will of the people more than once. Our judges actually rule the country from the bench, which is not the way our founding fathers intended. But anyway, the King of England was able to rein in his judges. Henry, though, came into a real problem when dealing with Thomas Becket. Thomas Becket was like a friend of Henry's, but he had no church experience. Well, when the Archbishop of Canterbury the Archbishop of Canterbury, by the way, is still the highest church official in England. When the office became vacant, Henry appointed Thomas Becket thinking, I've got a worldly-minded man in office and he'll do my bidding. He didn't know that when he made Thomas Becket a churchman, Thomas Becket would start dressing like a churchman, and acting like one, but worse than that, start thinking like a churchman. And all of a sudden, Thomas Becket began to take the church's side on every issue, and even the Pope sent a letter to him about, hey, Thomas Becket, in effect, said, cool it, you're just going to stir up trouble that we're not, the church not prepared to handle, just lay low. Thomas Becket, even with that letter, refused to lay low. He opposed Henry on every move. Well, the story goes, make a long story short, I mean, there were several issues that he opposed on. I won't go into detail, but Henry was sitting around his table one day eating a meal, and a new message came in, and Thomas Becket, your Majesty has done this. Henry looked around the table and discussed, all you dogs who sit around my table, can't any of you take care of this upstart for me? I mean, he was just simply in a fit of rage. He didn't mean it, probably. But 4 knights decided that, the king apparently wants Thomas Becket. So 4 knights went to Thomas Becket's rectory, and they killed Thomas Becket. Well, this really upset all of England, who rallied. It really hurt Henry badly. And Henry initially lost his fight with the church on account of that. He had to give the church everything he wanted. He had to do penance for the rash deed. In those days, even kings often did penance. And it basically meant that the church was going to hold on to its status for a long time. Essentially, folks, what the church was doing was dealing too much in worldly affairs. And one of the issues was the issue of all the church lands the church had that didn't need. In effect, here's what happened. When a person would die, to help guarantee his salvation, he would will a certain part of his land to the church. Well, after a while, the church accumulated almost all the good land in the country, and the people who were not church people had none. I want to say this, partly because of this. I've said my history. In my will, I've left nothing to an organization. I leave it all to my children. I figure, hey, I can give to the organization I like while I'm alive, and then after I'm gone, they can give the organization if they like it. But let them decide where it goes once they get it. But a lot of parents will leave their wealth, what they have, to an organization. The result is the children wind up somewhat impoverished. Now, this happened in the Middle Ages, and the King Henry wanted to get some of these lands back. They said the church doesn't need all this land, and try to get them back. Well, he failed in it. He made a rash decision, and but this became an issue that kings had to deal with. Eventually, These lands were taken back from the church. Henry VIII took a lot. Charles Martel took a lot. But eventually these lands found their way back into the hands of the families that originally owned them. But that was jumping ahead of the story a little bit. Anyway, Henry was followed by King Richard, who spent a lot of his time fighting in the Holy Land. I'll talk more about Richard the Lionhearted later. Now, Richard was followed by King John. Now, you notice I don't call him John the First. He'll be called John the First if there's ever a John the Second. But the problem is the English royal family does not name its children John, and haven't in 800 years, because this John was one of the most wicked kings. Some people say the worst king England ever had. I mean, he was a drunk. He gambled a lot. He hung around with a bad crowd. He imposed unfair taxes. However, he went to France, where he had some lands in France one day, and when he came back, he found all the nobility had stood up to him, to a man, and said, "Sir, we want you to sign this document that guarantees our rights." This document is called the Magna Carta. King John signed it. If you actually read the Magna Carta, a lot of it is today obsolete, but it was the beginning of the people of England standing up to their king and saying, "King, you have to rule according to law. You cannot rule any way you please." John saw the entire nobility was against him. He signed, and this is believed by many to be the beginning of England limiting the power of its kings. Now today, as a result of this, England still has its kings and queens. France no longer acknowledges they have a king or queen because France never stood up to its kings until the French Revolution. They allowed their kings to be the result. The people of France finally rose up, chopped off one of the king's heads. England chopped off one of its king's heads also. But to this day, there is still a king and queen in France. And yes, Queen Elizabeth II is descended from King John. The power of the kings was limited. Now later, one of John's descendants, John's grandson or great-grandson, was forced into a monastery. Edward II, I'm talking about. It was as a great-grandson. And later they were to chop off a king's head. But eventually the kings of England learned they have to rule according to law. Now today's kings of England are so pathetically weak that one time Queen Elizabeth II tried to express, actually she expressed an opinion, and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in effect rebuked her sharply and said, "You're not supposed to, you're not allowed, you keep your mouth shut, Your Majesty, you don't express opinions." This actually happened about 30 or so years ago when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister of Great Britain. Today's kings and queens are not even allowed to express opinions on controversial matters. Somebody looked at me like kind of shocked. Yeah, they're told what to do, and when they make their speeches, they're told their speeches are approved by the Prime Minister. They can't even speak without the Prime Minister's approval. Anyway, but they still are on the throne. They still live in a palace. All right. We'll stop right here and take up next time. Well, now, one thing I must mention. A later king was forced to convene an organization called Parliament. Yeah, then I'll call it Parliament. And to this day, the English is controlled by their Parliament. It's still in existence, but one of their kings, King Henry III, I believe, or one of them, was forced to convene a Parliament. And this Parliament has ruled England jointly with their kings from that day to this.